Hi, my name is Bill Brandt, and I'd like to welcome you to this ASU Lightworks production. The energy transition is already creating new wealth with solar and wind power. The transition to a low-carbon economy will present an even bigger investment opportunity. Technologies do not invent themselves, and this transition requires innovation on a significant scale. During the Hacking for Carbon panel, we discussed how government, philanthropy, and private capital can fund, de-risk an innovation pipeline. The panel gave thoughtful insights on nurturing innovation, managing risk in a lean startup era, and the policies of funding needed to support the new carbon economy. Join this important conversation and consider remaining engaged as a leadership community, advancing new partnerships and collaborations to create opportunities for investment in the new carbon economy. A special thank you to our sponsors, ASU's Knowledge Enterprise Development, ASU Lightworks, the National Council on Science and the Environment, the Security and Sustainability Forum, and Carbon 180.
The topic tonight is how do we accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy? And we have a number of really interesting panelists to talk to and get some ideas. And then, as I think you know, we're going to do a little work at the tables after the panel is done. But we have about an hour to hear from the panelists. Let me introduce myself first and then the panelists. I'm Bob Litterman. I'm on the board of the Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State. I also sit on a number of other nonprofit boards and work at a firm called Kepos Capital. I was the head of risk management at Goldman Sachs for a number of years and became very interested about a decade ago in carbon pricing and have been working steadily in this field trying to make progress on that. I sit on the board, among other boards, I sit on the board of the Climate Leadership Council you may have heard of. This is the Baker-Schultz approach to carbon tax, and well, we're hopeful. And I think it's very likely that we will get a carbon tax in this country probably after 2020, but you never know, there may be an opportunity sooner. So from the perspective, I think, of entrepreneurs and investors, right now, as I'm sure everyone in this room understands, the incentives to reduce emissions go the wrong way. There are globally significant subsidies. So we have a strong headwind that is preventing appropriate transition. That will undoubtedly change, hopefully soon enough. I mean, it should have happened a decade ago, but it's coming. And so the question is, what do we do now to prepare for that day when we get the right incentives and when everything starts moving in the right direction? And so to help us think about that, we have four very interesting panelists. I'll start over here on my right. Tony Michaels. Tony is also on the board of the Global Institute of Sustainability and heads, what is it called?
Midwestern Bioag.
Midwestern Bioag. And Tony is an expert in reducing carbon in agriculture, which is an important part of the problem. And then to my immediate right, we have Sarah Kearney. Is that right?
Carney.
And Sarah heads Prime Capital, and that is an investment firm, I guess you would call it, that tries to bring in philanthropic dollars to entrepreneurs who are starting up venture businesses. And then over here on my left, we have Aaron Burns. Aaron is the head of Carbon 180.
The policy shop.
The policy shop.
No,
okay.
his job is safe.
Okay, he's the head of the policy shop.
For now.
For now, if you're
For now.
I think he's on a plane, so
Okay, good. We're safe. You may see the tape.
This is being taped, though. Yeah.
we can edit it.
And Aaron is an expert in the policy that is needed to stimulate carbon capture, I would say, I guess, or you can tell us more about exactly what you do. And then to her left, we have Klaus Lochner. Klaus is a professor at ASU and an expert in direct air capture. So we will start by giving each of our panelists about 5 minutes to talk about what they do and how that fits into this overall picture of accelerating the transition. So maybe, Tony, we could start with you.
Here, start with me. So you can tell I'm the one that's also on the National Council for Science and the Environment Board, because we get together this evening with wine, and so I stayed well lubricated here. It's also my excuse if I slip up and say something I shouldn't. So I'm Tony Michaels. I'm now the CEO of Midwestern BioAg, which is a sustainable agriculture business. We touch about a third of all the organic farms in the country, but we're mostly a conventional farming business where we look at how to improve farms by a systems way of thinking. And that systems approach, from the farmer's perspective, gives them higher yield of more valuable crops that have more nutrition. But from the environmental perspective, it turns out to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, store carbon, and reduce the amount of nutrients that go into rivers. And so there's a whole series of environmental benefits that are in our world secondary to that. I was actually an oceanographer at the beginning, which is part of the drinking thing, and spent a lot of time at sea studying sort of global carbon and nutrient cycles, greenhouse gas uptake by the atmosphere. About half of our greenhouse gases by the oceans, about half end up in the oceans. Did a little weird side thing in Bermuda where I ended up in insurance, which sort of taught me about how little pieces of missing science in a big industry can actually change that industry once you make the connection. So then it ended up at the University of Southern California. Sorry for those people that are UCLA fans, we built something called the Wrigley Institute. Julie Wrigley, who was also the founder of the Global Institute on Sustainability at ASU, was our initial founding vision for that. And it was really about this idea of how do you take the scholarship that happens at universities and turn it into actionable value to businesses that can then scale the business. And we did that for 12 years. It didn't work. The normal way universities thought at that time wasn't successful at propagating things through businesses. I don't like failing, so I left the university, built some businesses, got into private equity, deployed a bunch of capital around different business models for scaling innovations, came back into contact with my uncle's old company in sustainable ag, and then at one point got together a group of families and we bought this company to scale agriculture. And agriculture is about 15% of the greenhouse gases. There's a lot of carbon storage in the soils. There's a lot of emissions, mostly nitrous oxide, that good farming practices can make go away while you're making more money. And that's the key thing, my message and some of the scaling things. You got to find the things that are more profitable than the incumbent activity and have the better environmental benefits. And by doing that, you then have to find the business models that allow those more profitable things to scale, because there's some reason they're not scaling right now. And so that's, I think, what I'll probably touch on.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Carney. I founded Prime Coalition in 2014 based on my own experience running a private foundation and based on my graduate research in the engineering systems division at MIT, where I sat and read the tax code for a couple of years. Very glamorous. Prime is a public charity that partners with philanthropists to place charitable capital into market-based solutions to climate change. This means that the dollars we use would otherwise be made as grants to nonprofits, but instead with us go to for-profit companies that promise gigaton scale CO2 equivalent emissions reduction and would otherwise have a difficult time raising sufficient financial support. The money we work with can come back to grantors to re-grant to other good causes, and we have 3 programs that we run. The first is facilitating charitable investments. The second is improving climate impact assessment among early stage investors. And the third is helping to build a marketplace of charitable investment, something that is kind of just starting to be built out in the US. For the purposes of this panel, I'm going to focus on our investments program, but I hope we'll loop back on the climate impact assessment piece later if it's of interest. So Prime made its first investment in 2015, and since then we've facilitated financing rounds for 10 companies. We've mobilized $47.8 million, where $23 million came from charitable sources and $24.8 came from commercial co-investors. Our financing rounds range in size size from $500,000 to $6 million. And our goal is really to grow this tribe of charitable asset owners that are making investments to mitigate climate change. And we want to make that tribe as big as possible. You know, there's 86,000 foundations in the US, and these types of transactions really hadn't happened before we started doing it back in 2014, 2015. Our mission is to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So we're a nonprofit with a nonprofit mission. Prime has a 10-year, 3-phase plan to advance our mission. Phase 1 is now complete. We're halfway through phase 2, and we're very happy to be pressured to start thinking about phase 3 sooner than we anticipated this year. Phase 1 focused on exploring the boundaries of what you're allowed to do with charitable capital and becoming experts in the mechanics of how to do it. We syndicated philanthropists into investments one company at a time. So imagine a movie star like Will Smith supporting or making a recoverable grant to a grid capacity energy storage company, or imagine a large software company like Autodesk making a grant to a reverse osmosis membrane company that improves the energy efficiency of desalination of water. Or imagine a conservative community foundation on the East Coast like the Boston Foundation supporting a waste heat recovery to electricity conversion company in Chicago. QuidNet, RedWave, Connector, Anfiro, Rebound, Right Electric, Opus 12, Tro, Melinda, and Lilac. From 2015 through 2018, we supported these 10 extraordinary companies. We had 91 different philanthropic organizations participate in the transactions, and that included 7 different donor-advised fund sponsors, 44 different private foundations, 40 first-time philanthropic investors. That means they'd never used a recoverable grant or a program-related investment before. And this is the number I'm most proud of, 28 parties that had never done anything in energy or climate before. So those are the numbers I care about personally, because as we all know in this room, we really need to expand the universe of active investors in this space to address climate change at scale. So phase 2, where we are now, focuses on proving that you can aggregate philanthropy at a meaningful scale. The Prime Impact Fund launched in 2018 with $21 million closed to date, and we've made our first 2 investments. So I want to publicly recognize a few of the participants that I know are registered tonight. The first is the ClearPath Foundation, I know is represented here somewhere. And then Trammell Crow, I know is represented through Meredith from EarthX. So I'm really glad to have these just trailblazing parties that have already jumped in way ahead of the curve in the philanthropy community. Many of you may have heard my colleague Matthew Norden on the ASU webinar last month, and he manages our impact fund. And my other colleague Johanna Wolfson, some of you may know from her days at the Department of Energy. She co-manages the impact fund with Matthew. So phase 3, and I think what might be really interesting to those of you here that care about kind of carbon removal projects, focuses on building out a blended equity pool where charitable and commercial capital work hand in hand to support companies and underwrite risks that no traditional financing vehicle is able to underwrite. So imagine a $250 million fund where 30% is charitable, 70% is fiduciary from large global institutional investors. The 2 colors of money working together strategically can achieve things together that neither can achieve alone. The fiduciary capital protects the charitable intent. The charitable capital makes the math work in situations where it otherwise wouldn't for fiduciary investors. So these types of transactions that I'm talking about are really, really challenging for philanthropic organizations. We've designed Prime to lower the very high barriers that have prevented most organizations from making these types of investments in the past. We use grants, recoverable grants, program-related investments, and concessionary mission-related investments. Our partners can choose one company at a time or to come into the impact fund where they have exposure to a portfolio. To me, it's a no-brainer. So you can make a grant or a donation and never see that money again. That's a negative 100% financial return. Or you can make a charitable investment with Prime. It counts as a grant. You're building a for-profit company that can actually achieve scale to address our climate goals. You have the opportunity to get your grant back plus interest to re-grant to other good causes. So it's really hard to do all of that well. It's nearly impossible to do by yourself, no matter how many assets under management you might have at your foundation, and that's precisely why we built Prime, to provide expertise from the very best investors in our field, volunteering their time to work hand in hand with philanthropists to do these transactions. So if you happen to be attached to a foundation or a donor advised fund or a corporate giving program and you're interested to learn more about how to do this, I'd love to talk to you afterward, and I will stop there.
Great, thank you. Erin.
Yeah, so I'm Erin Burns. I'm the Associate Director of Policy at Carbon 180, formerly the Center for Carbon Removal. And we're, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a California-based NGO. We just opened a DC office a couple months ago when I came on board. And we do the work we do because we want a prosperous economy where we remove more carbon than we emit. And we opened up our DC office because we recognize that federal policy is necessary to reach that goal. So for a large-scale economic change to take place, and that's really what we're talking about here, you not only need a thriving ecosystem of entrepreneurs, you need serious policy support. And if you look at, for example, how we got to the level of renewables deployment we see today, it wasn't just about building efficient technology. It required years of metal R&D, strong tax incentives, ambitious renewable portfolio standards. To commercialize new technology, you need all of those things. And I want to quickly kind of talk about three things to set up the discussion. One is what's going on with federal carbon removal policy in the U.S. right now, what other things need to happen in the next few years, and how likely we are to see progress on all of that. So today I'd say we're at square one, maybe square two. There's been some really great work on outlining what policies are needed, but now it's time to turn those outlines into bills and amendments and do the work it takes to get those moving forward. And one of the most significant carbon removal policies to date was passed about a year ago. Last February signed into law, and this was a bill that updated an existing tax credit for carbon capture to include both direct air capture and non-enhanced oil recovery and carbon use for the first time. And the senators who spearheaded that bill, called the Future Act, introduced another bill right after its passage called the Use It Act, which would provide R&D support for both direct air capture and carbon use, and would start to look at some of the infrastructure challenges and issues we're going to have if we're going to deploy carbon capture and carbon removal at scale. Both of those bills were really bipartisan, and I think that speaks not just to the policy design in them, but also the politics of carbon removal. It's occupying this really interesting nonpartisan space where people are able to kind of project their own values onto it, which I think is really useful. So you can like it for the climate benefits like we do, you can like it for the economic potential, you can like it because you care about economic competitiveness and so on. So what else needs to happen? So we think the most pressing need, and this was something that was highlighted in the recent National Academy's report, is for a robust RD&D program that's going to require both significant changes in how the Department of Energy works and consistent appropriations and funding from Congress. To date, we've spent really in the single millions of dollars on direct air capture and in the tens of millions of dollars on carbon use, compared to hundreds of millions and sometimes billions of dollars on other clean energy technologies. What we're spending right now really isn't enough. We also need policies to help drive a thriving carbon tech market that can be a significant carbon price, or it can be other policies like tax incentives and federal procurement and preferences. But valuing carbon tech is a really important lever in the early deployment of carbon removal. We're also going to need something bigger, a climate-forward carbon capture and removal policy platform. Carbon removal has the best chance of succeeding in a world where there's significant carbon capture deployment. So I want to wrap up with a comment on how likely this is to happen. I'd say we're really optimistic. Maybe it's naive, but we're really optimistic. There's increasing interest from policymakers in carbon removal. I mentioned those two bills that were kind of spearheaded by the same group of senators. Their interest isn't waning. Many of them are here today. But we're also hearing from new members and folks on the Hill, offices we haven't met from before, who want to know about carbon removal for the first time. We also think more attention and urgency around climate change and around climate action more broadly is really good for carbon removal, and we've seen a lot more focus on that in recent months. You know, we've seen the introduction of carbon tax bills, a lot of attention, wherever you feel, however you feel about it, a lot of attention on the Green New Deal. Candidates and members are talking about this as one of the top 2 or 3 issues that they care about. And historically, that was only true for a couple of members, maybe for a handful. And whether those discussions on carbon tax or Green New Deal explicitly and always include carbon removal, I think isn't the most important thing. What's important, and frankly something we're really excited about, is that we are finally seeing this, that climate action is a priority for dozens and dozens of members, and we think that any push for climate action is ultimately something that's really helpful for carbon removal policy. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Erin. Klaus?
Hello, I'm Klaus Lackner. I'm the director for the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. I have been thinking about how to manage carbon since the early 90s. I got in this maybe 25 years ago. And I think what convinced me were several things. I was at the time at Los Alamos. I was interested in fusion energy. I was very clear on the fact that this is very far out, maybe in 2100, but for climate, fusion doesn't matter. But I also realized that the world really needs energy. If we see the development in the rest of the world, we need to figure out how to live with more energy consumption than we have today. And from a sustainability perspective, one of our really true big problems is a population explosion. And if you look at it, any country which managed to make the transition to a stable standard of living has also managed to stabilize its population. So if we want to solve this problem, we cannot withhold energy. We have to figure out how to make this happen. Where I was very contrarian at the time was the observation we are actually not running out of carbon. Back in 1990, 1992, everybody said this is just about running out. By 2000, there isn't any. And that turned out to be wrong. But that also meant that the carbon dioxide problem, the climate change problem, is not self-limiting, that we have plenty enough carbon to ruin the planet if we are not careful. As a matter of fact, if you add up today's oil reserves, they actually exceed what we can possibly put out, which also means there's an enormous economic conundrum because there are lots of people who own assets which they actually cannot bring to market. And sooner or later, the societal license to do that will fail and will be withheld. And at that point, things can get fairly catastrophic. So we have to figure out ways how to deal with it. And back then I said, well, we have 3 choices. We can go to solar energy at a very large scale, which I'm very optimistic we will succeed eventually. The second thing is we could go large-scale nuclear, which so far has been too expensive, but who knows? It is certainly big enough to solve the problem at the scale humans need energy. And the third one is we make our carbon energy carbon neutral. So that got me into where do we store all this. I started mineral sequestration. Today we talk a lot about geological sequestration, and right now in Iceland we combine the 2 ideas. So I got very excited about that. Then I worried about power plants which have no emissions. And then lately I said, well, half of all of our emissions end up in the atmosphere because they come from cars, from trucks, from airplanes and ships. And some of it is very, very hard to remove. And on top of it, all the emissions we already had, we can't get rid of. Roughly half of that CO2 we put out will stay for centuries in the atmosphere, and the other half rattles around in the biosphere and the surface ocean for a very long time. It'll take 1,000 years for the temperature to come back down again. And so we have to think of this as nearly permanent. We have a carbon budget, and we probably already overspent. If we haven't overspent yet, we will this century, in the next decade or 2. If you believe the 450 number or the 1.5 degree warming, there's no practical way we can stop in time. So we have to figure out how to treat this problem as a waste management problem. If you mobilize carbon, you are obligated to take it back. And by the way, at this point, we have no choice anymore because we have to take back the 100 ppm we already put out. So we have to figure out how to get back the carbon from the environment. In part, we can get it back by growing trees, by growing biomass in any form or shape. But if you start asking, how much do you really need? If you really want to get 2.5 ppm back down every year and in 40 years collected 100 ppm's worth, you can work it out on the back of the envelope. The land you need or the area you need is bigger than current agricultural land. And don't think you won't have an environmental footprint if you go to that scale. So that convinced me early on that we actually should figure out how to pull the CO2 by technical means out of the atmosphere. Just like we fly faster than a bird, we probably can pull CO2 back faster than a tree. So I started to think about it. And one of the things which struck me and gave me the optimism that one can work this was a very simple observation. I'll give you a cubic kilometer of air, and a windmill goes after it. It mines the kinetic energy in that cubic kilometer. I can say, how much is that worth? Well, if I give you 5 cents for a kilowatt hour, and at 6 meters a second, I can work it all out. The cubic kilometer holds $300 worth of kinetic energy, and maybe a third of it you can get. By the way, that's what a big windmill sees in an afternoon. If I now say I give you a tipping fee for getting rid of that CO2 in the same cubic kilometer of $30 a ton, which is a very optimistically known number, that same cubic kilometer contains $21,000 worth of CO2. So that said to me, if I can build a device like a windmill, which touches the air to pull the CO2 out rather than the kinetic energy, doesn't sound so hopeless. And so that's where we started in 1999. We didn't really know how to do it. We learned a lot since. We now have technologies which I think can do it. They are still way too expensive right now. I think we have to get down to $100 a ton to make it work. But if you had made the same argument about photovoltaics in 1960, you were 100 times too expensive. The APS said $600 a ton. Climeworks, a company which is doing it, says $600 a ton right now. Was shoestring kind of things. Probably ours is even more shoestring, was even more expensive. But I would argue, you come down a factor 10, you are actually in the right range. If you are at $60 a ton, that would add 50 cents to a gallon of gasoline, and your gasoline would be carbon neutral. I think it is affordable. I think we have actually no choice. And I think there should be a lot of people who actually would benefit. Think of an oil company which could say our gasoline is carbon neutral. They are losing the automobile market right now because people say you need to have batteries because the CO2 is unmanageable. For the car, you can go to the batteries. For the airplane, you will never figure that out because you can't lift the load of batteries you would need to carry along. So that got me going. I think one can do it, and I think we have to think about these technological fixes, even though many people think they're ugly. At the end, we could have had that discussion in 1980, but we failed to have it. And now we have to pay the price and come back down, because I think 350.org is probably right, and we have to get back to 350.
Wow. Well, thank you, Klaus. That's a nice optimistic note, but
I'm not so sure about whether it's optimistic. I'm just telling you, we will stabilize the CO2. Whether it hurt a lot because we waited too long, or whether we did it smoothly, on that last question, I'm not so optimistic.
yes, well, it's a matter of time, isn't it? Can we do it quickly enough?
Right now, every person on the planet has 20 tons of carbon left. In the US, we go through this in 4 years. In the rest of the world, it'll take us 16 years. In 16 years from now, we hit 450 parts per million.
Yeah.
And that's where the IPCC since 2000 has said is the limit. We can argue whether that's 1.5 or 2 degrees. It's somewhere in between those two numbers.
Yep. So we've got to accelerate this. Tony, what is your experience about accelerating and bringing this to scale?
Well, to me, the challenge here is less the technological innovations and much more directly on the scaling mechanisms, the business model things that allow us to do scaling. And part of the reason that I left academia, part of the reason I left the private equity world and went into this farming thing is that we have, the easiest case should be you're going to make a whole lot more money doing something different, making much more nutritious food that people are going to be healthier eating, and why on earth doesn't the whole world just change to do that? It's kind of a no-brainer, and yet it doesn't change. You've got a whole variety of reasons, incumbents and other things. And so what we're looking at is, what do you really have to change about the fundamental business model of the industry, the fundamental business model of our companies, the fundamental context? Some of this is policy, but frankly, we kind of steer a little away from policy towards things that we can control. And the kinds of things that we look at is that when you have a great, more profitable thing, in this case for farms, to do, and they're not doing it, what are those barriers? And can you make money getting rid of those barriers? In this case, it's a finance issue. You got to spend more to make more in a world where you're making nothing and where you have no ability to borrow unless you mortgage the farm, and in the 80s when you did that, you lost the farm. And so you got this whole cultural thing. So you got to come up with a different business model for taking risks, lending to these farmers, insuring the risks, which allows it to be much easier to propagate that model, to let them not feel so scared about taking a chance on something, take that risk away from them. And on conventional side, it's still tough. Commodity crops are kind of in the toilet. They just went down another 20% when the tariffs started. You know, it's tricky. Organic actually is pretty easy because if you're a really good organic farmer, you're making a lot of money right now. And so you can look at transition finance as the short-term example where the financial benefit on the far end is much more obvious. But really, you're doing it to set up the financial tools, the insurance metrics, the training of both banking and insurance industries that allows them to be comfortable with it, so that when you have, you know, how many acres are really going to go organic? It's going to be some percentage of them, but the rest of the acres are still going to grow food. When you go to that less profitable model, but still more profitable transition, you've now got tools. It's just sort of mining into the larger but lower margin part of the industry. And so we business model things like that we look at. My previous life on the private equity side, you know, we were looking at these early stage technologies. You know, we have so many pilots, we have so many trials, these early stage companies. They're wonderful for their inventiveness, but most of them do not think until they need the next round of capital after the first couple on how you actually build the business. And we had a business model innovation which said, let's go out there and find the business that already exists at scale that's going to make the most profit if only an innovation existed. Don't start with the innovation, start with the profit. Look at incumbent companies at a reasonable scale. You don't want the really big ones. They're too bureaucratic. Can't be so small. You don't have any scale. There's kind of a size in the couple $100 million to $1 billion revenue scale. And say, you know, who would make the most money if only something innovative existed? And we got an environmental mindset, so we picked on those. And you can actually go through and sort these companies out. And then you go back to the academic community, into the inventor and entrepreneur community and say, okay, I need an innovation that does this. I don't need the best solar. I don't need the best waste to energy. I need the one that's going to make this profit, this pipe that's got this material coming out at this flow rate with this kind of constituents in it, and it's got to be turned into this energy to feed these compressors to cool this building to do. It's a well-posed problem. And the best first principles technology, which is the golden, the holy grail of the academic community, isn't necessarily the one that makes that profit real. If you know how much profit you're going to make on that company by, say, turning their waste into this kind of waste into that kind of energy, you know what your capital budget is. It's a well-designed problem. You can go in there and find that innovation, pair it with the company. Now, it's still hard to get people to make a decision. It's hard to get the entrepreneur to say, you know, give this thing, sell this thing right now that you think is going to change the world to this one company. It's hard to get a company that's fully incumbent and comfortable where they are to do something different. There was this little golden era in 2000. I left academia in 2007. My wife was the real trooper. Started a company in 2007, left my tenured faculty position to do a startup, and then 2008 happened. You know, it's kind of a tricky thing. But the interesting thing about that's when I went into private equity. If you can't talk them into doing this, buy them. And so we went out and bought these companies. We would buy the incumbent. We would buy the early stage technology. We'd put them together. In a short period of time, we built the largest LED lighting company in North America, the largest recycling company, a bunch of cradle-to-cradle businesses. And it was just this whole idea. We were just seeing it through a different prism for our business model that was taking the transformative technology and the incumbent that would make the most profit, buying them and forcing them to put together. And you know, that's one example. The farming one is another example. I think the thing is, get the creativity working on that, because I think that's the thing that is the most, from my perspective, missing. How do we scale these things by design? How do you get enough examples that the entrepreneurs can be asked at a much earlier stage? How are you going to scale this? What's the business model innovation that allows that scaling to be a natural product of this, rather than sort of the analogs of the biotech or biomedical or software businesses that we're currently using? So,
Great.
some thoughts.
Yeah, Sarah, you're bringing both philanthropic and investment capital together. How do you decide what the mix is, which kind of companies make sense for investors versus philanthropists, and how do you bring this to scale?
So if I think about the gap that we're addressing, I think a good number to have in your mind for this audience is while everyone was gathered in Paris for the climate agreement, Q2, Q3, and Q4 of that same year saw $0 of initial investment from the traditional venture community into anything flagged as clean tech by Thomson Reuters and PricewaterhouseCoopers. And Thomson Reuters and PricewaterhouseCoopers stopped using that flag after the fourth quarter of 2016.
Reckon them, yeah.
So we know they missed some things because there are family offices that are not required to report their data, but like that's a really acute capital gap. And it comports with what you were saying about, and oftentimes there's a financing gap that is kind of leaving good solutions that could save or make people money and simultaneously hack carbon on the table. And so in our gap, the very earliest stages of company formation, we make the list of every company in the US pre-seed to Series B across energy, agriculture, waste, and water every year. Last year, it was 2,363 companies. And to your question, how do you go from 2,400 down to the ones that we think are optimized or kind of the highest and best use of philanthropic capital? We had the luxury of starting from a blank sheet of paper. So we said, okay, we want the ones that are going to be attractive to follow-on commercial investors so they have a real chance of getting to scale. We want the ones that are going to have a hard time raising money because we don't want to crowd out traditional investors if the company is already ready for that type of support. And we want the ones that are going to make a really, really big difference on greenhouse gas emissions. And so those are our three investment criteria. We take the group of 2,400. We down select. First, we do a company-by-company climate impact assessment. We call it our emissions reduction potential, ERP calculation. If it's not in the half a gigaton to gigaton scale potential, it gets taken off the table. And then we have a group of the kind of most active and historically successful traditional venture capitalists in this sector come together and say, I would love to invest in this company. Here are the exact reasons that I would not be able to convince my partners to do that deal right now. And that's additionality. And so we have to convince ourselves that those are good reasons rather than bad reasons, because what we don't want to do with philanthropic capital is take it away from really important grant causes like policy. And instead, we don't want to make bad investments. We want to make good investments that would not otherwise be done because of the mismatch with the traditional venture asset class. And so that's what we have designed. We go from 2,400 at our firm down to 5 or 6 that we support every year. And we work exclusively with philanthropic capital. In the rounds that we raise, we do usually have commercial co-investors, or certainly in subsequent fundraising rounds, the whole goal is for these companies to graduate from philanthropy and become really attractive for traditional investors. So I'll just give one quick example. So our very first investment the idea came from a Saudi Aramco engineer, a geophysicist. His big idea was to use spent oil and gas wells that are no longer producing hydrocarbons to do pumped hydro downhole. So it's kind of taking traditional pumped hydro, which is the most ubiquitous form of grid storage today, and turning it on its head. Sounds like kind of a crazy idea. He did all the computational modeling. He needed to go and run a pilot test in the field in partnership with an oil and gas company. That was going to cost $1 million. You could waste $1 million in a couple of hours. Nobody wanted to pay for it. So we syndicated 4 philanthropists into this transaction, seed 1 round. We ran 1 pilot test in partnership with a big oil and gas company in West Texas. The test went really well. We were able to raise a seed 2. That was 50% charitable, 50% fiduciary investors. We ran 47 more tests. That allowed us to raise a seed 3, 80% fiduciary, 20% charitable. That recruited a CEO. The CEO was able to go out and raise a Series A, 100% fiduciary. It was a round co-led by Breakthrough Energy Ventures and Evoke Innovations out of Canada. And that's the model. You want companies to graduate from needing the charitable support. And this company, the big deal is that, I can't say the numbers because we're being recorded, but their cost reduction for grid energy storage is an order of magnitude less costly than the state-of-the-art battery company today. And so of those 2,400 opportunities, like there are diamonds in the rough that can really change the game for all types of industries related to hacking carbon.
If I could just put an accent point on that. We have about 40 investors, mostly family offices, a few sort of quasi-institutional folks, but we have 2 impact investors. and it's interesting because we didn't want the impact investors too early. You know, we really felt this is a market rate investment, and if you put an impact investor in early, you get tagged as a concessionary return kind of a player. And so there's this whole issue. And the weird thing is, McKnight is one of the main ones. They've been very public. We're their biggest direct investment on the impact side. They don't care about the food quality. They don't care about the health issues. It doesn't say they don't care. They don't care about climate. Their driver is nitrogen into the Mississippi River. And so they had a very targeted thing they cared about. They really wanted to be in 19 million pounds a year of nitrogen aren't in the Mississippi because of the farms that we work with. And so, but we had to pick, where do you even talk to them? Because there's this issue of getting tagged too early as one of these impact companies, and you're not going to make any money. So we had to really develop our bona fides, get people in that were doing, and of course these families, they really care. And a lot of food is easy because people care about food. And so you can't say that your investors don't care, but we really had to be cautious about the impact of taking on that money. We took it on in our C and our D rounds. It's been beautiful capital. They introduce us to everybody and their mother that thinks about these kinds of issues. So you get on all kinds of other farms because their relations later on. So there's a real value to it. But now we have this issue where we're trying to create these transition finance things that don't exist. And so there's these extra risks that we can look at it. We know they're just not that big. But the industry doesn't. There's no experience that tells you how big these risks are. And so there's this feeling like, oh, we're going to take a big risk if we loan some money to a farmer that's going to try and do something different. And we got to charge a lot of interest on this or have really good collateral if we're going to make that loan. And it just destroys the market. All of a sudden, these impact people, because we know there's a return, and they've been following us for a couple of years now. They know, oh my God, if these people are going to farm anything like your average farmer, we're going to make a killing. And so they internally know there's a return there. It's not just they're going to get their money back, they're going to get a way above market return, but they're taking an uncertainty away from the market can't handle. So there's really good places, but I think you got to be careful how you dance, right? So you dance at the right spot, you pick them,
Well, we call it the
analogy.
The risk is like a scarlet letter, like you were talking about, right? It's like just because you're using charitable capital doesn't mean your investees are charity cases. Mm-hmm. What we say is you have to be twice as smart to do it well, and I think McKnight is a real leader. Mm-hmm. They've built out their team. What makes this really difficult for most large institutional foundations, certainly, but also smaller family offices or just individuals and families that want to be deploying, money from their donor advised fund or from their foundation into these types of transactions, is that the kind of endowment side of the house and the grant making side of the house oftentimes are run by very different types of people. They don't communicate with each other, and the regulatory environment that governs them is opposite. So I want to talk with you afterward about where that money came from.
It came out of the corpus. Right, this is the hard thing, is that sometimes they'll do it and they'll just take it out of money they would have given for a grant. And that's fine, you get your thing done. But the real challenge is they have 20 to 30 times as much money sitting there developing that 3 to 5% a year return that they're giving away. And they're putting that into Exxon. So is that really in line with their values? And they know that. They have this bright line because they know how big a deal that is to all the people on the grant-making side. But you got to get it, and you're the kind of, you're giving them that comfort, that training ground. The other impact investor we have is the Franciscan Sisters of Mary. I don't know if you know, this is this beautiful little group of nuns that started a hospital and another hospital, and the next thing you know, they got this massive hospital chain, the biggest Catholic hospital chain, and they decided we can't run a hospital chain anymore, so they sold it they spun it out, and then they've got a little bit of money left over, so they invest in us. And it's cute to have the nuns there. And the hospital's in Madison, where our headquarters are. Our hospital, my healthcare comes from the same nuns. But their whole thing was follow somebody else, because this is like Prime is a way to do this as a more systematic thing. What the Franciscan Sisters just said is, who can we follow? McKnight. We'll follow McKnight, and then wherever McKnight goes, they just follow along and just tack on to every one of those. But that's,
So
that learning curve.
That was my other point, is that some people think about this as the risk of the scarlet letter. What we have found is the opposite in our transactions, is once you get a lot of the big name, reputable organizations, I would say McKnight is an example. Many of our partners are examples of that. All of a sudden, it kind of becomes a club that you want to be a part of.
Any university endowments? Sorry.
Well, I actually think it's a good point. We're dominating the conversation at this end of the table, but what's a good point is that university endowments have a fiduciary responsibility to preserve their capital over time to provide for their students and educate the world. But if you can combine those assets together with the type of money that we're talking about, the math works for university endowments, and of course they would love to do these kind of mission-aligned things when the math works. So we just need to, the new piece of it is the philanthropic part, and that's what makes the math work. So we need work together to kind of bring more of those charitable assets working hand in hand with the really smart financial community.
All right, well, we're going to go to the other side of that. But, Sarah, before we do, I have a question for you. When you have both philanthropic and fiduciary capital,
Yes.
do they have different returns? I mean, how is that structured?
That is probably like a whole semester's worth of a university
we'll come
course.
back.
So I'll come back to it after we hear
My
from them.
my
more.
quick answer is no difference in our case, except for reporting. So I had to create a whole reporting structure on the environmental benefits. That's why I know 19 million pounds, 996,000 tons of CO2. I mean, it's because they wanted to be tracking, and so
that's why you have your emissions.
Well,
reduction.
so this committee that we have that writes down the reasons that they would not be able to do it from their traditional venture firms, if the technology development timeline is too long, they have a pilot test to run that is a binary risk that we're unwilling to underwrite, or there's some exogenous risk factor that we are not comfortable with. Those are reasons that make the case for this type of capital. And as long as that's present and documented at the time of the investment, all of the other terms can look exactly the same. So you don't need to mess
Nothing
with
different.
the terms to make a company less attractive to follow-on investors. In fact, the whole goal is the opposite.
Great. All right, Aaron,
Yeah.
what are your secrets to scaling this up?
Use it softball. No, I mean, I think for us, I'll caveat this with, I've been working in this field for several years, but at Carbon 180 for about 2 months. So we are going through a very intensive process to figure out kind of what are the specifics on the policy front that you need. I do think we have a lot of resources to work from. Some folks have done some really fantastic studies and reports on kind of what are the next needs. And I think the most pressing one is a larger kind of RD. I say RDD&D. I think I'm the only person who uses that, but we mean everything from lab scale research, which we think can be really important, to federal support for deployment of these technologies. And so I think that is a really, really big piece. I think that getting a carbon tech market up and running is really important, right? Having some sort of value for CO2 makes a big difference in a lot of the cost calculations. And when we talk about things like the change to the 45Q tax credit so that you can get $35 to $50 per ton for your direct air capture facility, that plus selling it for some amount per ton to be used for cement, this makes a big difference. I think the other thing is the scale of it. I think sometimes on the policy side, we can lose sight of the kind of longer term needs and the scale that we're talking about. And that gets to, I mentioned the Use It Act has a section that starts to look at the infrastructure needs for carbon capture and removal. And I think that's a big piece of this. I think we've, in the policy world, I think carbon capture and carbon removal are pretty tied together. And when we think about carbon capture policies, I think we've made mistakes in the past where we've thought about it as a project by project issue. Let's just get future gen built. Let's just build, Petronova. Let's just build, whatever Kemper big facility it is, and that'll bring down the cost, and it'll just magically happen somehow. And I think we need to shift when we talk about policy development to more of a how do we build the kind of ecosystem that allows these projects to be deployed at scale. So I think, again, tax incentives, I think what's the federal role in, looking at regulatory issues and developing infrastructure and all of these enabling factors so that we can have this really thriving ecosystem. And we have, not just in the sense that we have this really full RD&D pipeline, but that we have the private sector that's able to take advantage of these pieces, that the federal government's really in the best position to address, whether that's pipelines or the Valley of Death, or, I think we need to look at it as a much broader question and have that vision that Klaus kind of laid out, where we're talking about really large-scale deployment of these technologies.
Do you think there's an understanding on Capitol Hill of what's required?
No, sorry guys. I said I was in the Senate. I think yes and no. I mean, I think some folks, there are lots of folks who understand this. I mean, the Hill is full of very smart people who spend a lot of time working on this. I think it's hard sometimes when you're in that position to spend time thinking about what do you need 10 years from now. That's just, they're incredibly busy and you have a million things coming at you, and you don't often have the breathing room to step back and say, what are we talking about 10 years from now? And you have to think about kind of what is the art of the possible right now. And I think that, that's really where I think we see at Carbon 180 our job, and some of the NGOs who work in the policy development space, is to be able to step back, have that breathing room, say, we can talk about the scale of the challenge and come in and ask for a ridiculous amount of money that they're going to, kind of roll their eyes at because they know what's possible. And we try and balance those things. But I think there's an understanding of the scale. I think it's our job, or we see it as our job in NGOs, to do a lot of the heavy lifting, to talk about, okay, working backwards from the scale we need in 10, 20, 30 years, what are the policies we need to work through now, and how do we work with folks on the Hill to make sure that those are things that are not, I can propose a set of policies now that's going to get us there, they're never going to get enacted. So how do we work with them to balance those two things?
Klaus, we talked before about we're running out of time. What do you think is required, and can we get there? Is it possible?
I think it is more challenging than most people think. And even in this room, even in the IPCC, if you look at, people say, well, we need negative emissions, and they say maybe about 10 or 15. Nobody here blinked an eye when I said we probably have to come back 100 ppm, and we should do that in about 40 years. That's 36 or 40 gigatons a year. So if you start getting serious about it, you suddenly see how big these numbers are. To put it back to the waste management picture I had before, carbon dioxide right now is a waste we feel free to dump into the atmosphere. We have to, the moment you start saying this is a waste management problem, we all have about a 20 ton a year problem. It's actually in the US about 17 tons per person. If this were water, you couldn't fill a year's worth for us into this room, because we would grossly overfill this. So bottom line is, what do we do with 17 tons of anything? I can't build, if I double it, I have carbonates. I can't build enough Greek revival columns in front of my house to keep up with that. So the problem is just fantastically large. And I do think we have to admit that we can't use all of that carbon. We will not get to scale by doing just that. So we have to declare it a waste management and ultimately a landfilling problem. And suddenly you actually have a financial incentive, whether you do this by a tax or by simply saying by fiat, like they did with sewage in the 19th century. You cannot just dump the slop in the street anymore. You have to run it through a pipe, and you are going to pay for it, in that case, with a tax. I am paying a company called Waste Management good money to get my garbage taken away. And guess what? They make money on it, but they deliver a service, not a carbon product. And if you open that door to a waste management service, you actually, I think, could scale up and gradually get there. Not overnight. I think we kid ourselves if we think we will do this in time. So I always have trouble with this moral hazard problem and say, oh, if you do air capture, then nobody will do anything. I would say right now you are actually getting in the way of getting things fixed, because mitigation alone cannot solve the problem anymore. I'm not against mitigation, quite the contrary, we need that too. But if we don't start doing air capture and negative emissions in general, pulling it back by biological means and technical means as fast as we possibly can, the overshoot will be a lot larger. Yesterday in the talk, I said, we are a car going way too fast and we are going to hit the guardrail. The question is not anymore whether we will hit the guardrail, but whether we rip off the fender or roll, right? We still have control over that, but we will have to start cleaning up. And I think if you want to get to scale, you have to manage this like a waste management problem and allow then the private sector to get in. And then the private sector, the economics of it can also decide whether you want to still use fossil carbon or whether that's a foolish idea. Right? The markets can figure this out. My bet is on solar, but nevertheless, I see 50 years of significant carbon pulling back in order to store it. But then you can also have the vision that you make synthetic fuels at a penny or less a kilowatt hour of renewable energy and convert it into fuels which are now made in a closed cycle. And that can go on without impacting the environment all that much. So I think we have ways of moving forward. Will we be in time? No, we will not, because we're already too late. Can we minimize the damage? There's a big difference between waiting another 30 years and getting started today.
I'll spend a minute on this. Look, I'm a risk management guy. It's very clear to me this is a risk. We're not pricing it. When you don't price the risk, you take too much risk. That's what led to the financial crisis. It's what leads to all kinds of problems. Every economist in the world knows what we have to do is price the externality associated with emissions. Getting it done, I think we're going to get it done soon. It's necessary for the survival of society as a whole. And everyone on Capitol Hill knows this. They're afraid. And there's a lot of different frictions. It's a global problem. We don't have an adequate global governance structure. It's a problem where the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies are losers today. If we price it, it doesn't help their bottom line. And the people who benefit are future generations, and it takes a long time. So it's a very difficult political problem, but we're getting very close because everyone knows we need to do it. And so it's kind of sad. Our political system really responds to the money more than the votes. And the money right now says, this is not good for me. But we were just talking about people understand that it's real. They understand that it's human caused. That percentage has gone up dramatically in the last 10 years. And then this year, you have the IPCC report, you have the national assessment. Everyone is beginning to realize we're running out of time. This is, I know for my grandchildren, they're going to be living in a different world. The world today is, 1 degree C higher than historical average. They're going to live in a world that's at least 1 3/4, maybe 2. That's just a different world. That it's totally immoral for our generation to leave that for our kids.
Ask a follow-up question, lady in the back.
Okay.
After moderator.
Yeah.
You said you're a risk manager, right?
Yes.
And you believe in you are with the climate leadership council.
Yes.
And you're pushing the carbon tax and dividend bill.
Yes.
I've been following this, and you sent very positive words about it. Could you give us, from a risk manager's perspective, how much of that bill will help at least answer some of the questions that were raised here?
Oh, it'll help tremendously. Look, right now we are operating in a world where there's a horrible headwind to all of these technologies, to all these businesses that want to make, to clean up the atmosphere. As soon as we start putting, a price on carbon, there's going to be a tailwind. All of a sudden, these businesses that are relying on philanthropic dollars are going to be making profits. And there's 7 billion economic agents out there, whether they're consumers or producers or entrepreneurs or investors or philanthropists. And all of a sudden, they're going to be moving in the right direction rather than moving in the wrong direction. It's black and white.